on MS Now.
Today, what we know about the high-level negotiations between the U.S. and Iran as the political fallout grows for Trump on Capitol Hill. Then the world's first trillionaire, how he could turn his wealth into power and what it could mean for the country. Plus our keynote conversation. What's going on with the Strait of Hormuz? Is it open or closed? And what's going to happen with gas prices? Money, Power, Politics is just getting started on this Monday morning. Good morning once again. I am Stephanie Ruhle, live from Times Square. It is 9 a.m. on the East Coast, 6 a.m. out west, and check your calendar because we are 134 days away from the midterms, and you are watching Money, Power, Politics. As we come on the air today, the world is waiting to see what will happen after the first round of negotiations between the United States and Iran. High-level talks, including Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, wrapped up early this morning. Mediators are sounding optimistic, pointing to some progress on communication over the Strait of Hormuz and a new push to end the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Earlier this morning, Vance said they did make good progress on the nuclear issue. Watch this.
The Iranians have agreed to invite IAEA inspectors back into their country. That is a major milestone for the American people and the first step in permanently denuclearizing or permanently ending a nuclear weapons program in Iran. And that's exactly what we wanted to do. That's exactly what we asked to happen. We made a lot of great progress on other nuclear talks.
The talks nearly went off the rails over the weekend when President Donald Trump made new threats against Iran, saying that if Iran closes the strait, they, quote, won't have a country, and saying the people that were doing the negotiating won't even make it back to Iran. Now, it is worth pointing out that the very first paragraph in the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran, that is this peace treaty thing, it includes that neither side will threaten the other. So here's just a bit of what happened over the weekend.
Jared and Steve have been on the ground now for a few hours, dealing with some of the technical elements of this negotiation. I expect that I will leave sometime the next couple of days.
All of those people who are supposed to be here for a round of negotiations, they are either here now in Switzerland or on their way. Vice President J.D. Vance just took off. He is on his way now here to Switzerland.
Can we turn over a new leaf? Can we change relations in the Middle East permanently? Or do we go back to doing things the old way, which is not our preference, but is certainly very much something that can't happen.
President Trump telling Fox News that the U.S. may take over the strait in the future if they have to. He spoke with Iranian officials overnight and said, you close it and you won't have a country.
The leaders are likely to leave soon, and technical talks will continue by the negotiating teams from each country. We're also tracking breaking news this morning in the UK, where Prime Minister Keir Starmer is resigning. He says he's going to stay on until his Labour Party picks its new leader. When that person does take office, they will be, this matters, the 7th British Prime Minister in the last 10 years. You got a lot of questions today? Me too. Well, I want to hear from you. Send us whatever you got about today's news, what's happening this week. Click on the code on your screen. Send us those questions. We're going to try to get to at least some of them later in the program. But for now, let's get smarter with the help of our lead-off panel this morning. Dave Weigel is back, political reporter for Semaphore. Tyler Pager is here, White House correspondent for the New York Times. And David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch. Tyler, okay, can you help us just start with these negotiations? What's actually going on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I was in Islamabad, Pakistan a few weeks ago with J.D. Vance when he came out after a marathon session of negotiations and struck a very pessimistic tone, basically said there was no deal, got up and left. There is a very different posture here than we've seen over the last several weeks. Of course, this comes after they actually signed a memorandum of understanding, but J.D. Vance did announce some sort of concrete progress, allowing that he said Iran is allowing IAEA inspectors back into the country. Now, again, Stephanie, as you mentioned, all of this feels very tenuous. The president had some bellicose rhetoric over the weekend. There was continuing fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. So there are a lot of factors here that could lead to this fragile ceasefire deal, whatever you want to call it, to fall apart. We'll see what the next phases of this are, but it's also important to remember before the war started, there were several rounds of talks between Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Iranian counterparts mediated by various countries in the Middle East. Those talks collapsed, which led to this conflict. And now you add the other level of the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz. There's just so many variables in the mix that it's hard to always keep track of how much forward progress is being made. But the rhetoric and the posture of these officials at this point is quite different than we've seen over the last several weeks, at least publicly.
Okay, it may be hard to keep track, but I just want to level set here, because today marks exactly 1 year since Operation Midnight Hammer. That was Trump's bombing of Iran's nuclear sites. At the time, he said those strikes, quote, totally obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. Then, of course, just months later, he said he had to launch new strikes. That was the start of this war on Iran, because they were weeks away from having a nuclear weapon and they planned to use it. But for fact's sake, there is no evidence backing up those last claims that the president made. So, David Drucker, it was either untrue a year ago or untrue when the president started this war. But either way, it sure seems like Iran is consuming the president's second term.
Well, I think it's definitely something that people who voted for him didn't expect, right? Because one of the things he's been talking about over the past 10 years is that it was previous presidents who got the United States into these so-called forever wars in the Middle East, that anything he would do would be quick, short bursts. And, you know, all it took was a smart negotiator, that all this stuff wasn't necessary. And when you look at the Soleimani assassination and Operation Midnight Hammer, the president pretty much stuck to his word, although we always knew that negotiating peace in the Middle East was a lot more complicated. I think a couple of things here, Steph. One, on the domestic political side, Americans generally didn't support the war, and so they're not going to be sorry to see it go, whether or not the president got himself a good deal or not. On the issue of that, we've always known that the Iranians were not trustworthy. They're still committed to Israel's destruction, a key ally of the United States in the Middle East. They're still a committed U.S. adversary. One of the reasons why Republicans for years have been critical of President Obama's JCPOA is because they didn't feel it did enough to rein in the Iranians and deal with the fact that you cannot trust them, inspections or not. And so the question now is, after all of the everything that President Trump has done with this war and this sort of what I expect to be a sort of endless negotiation where you can never really rely on anybody's word, is this going to create conditions that are better for the United States going forward or worse? Because now everything that happened before the war, you could in theory, right? Not everybody agreed with this, but you could in theory lay at the feet of the Obama administration and a flawed Iran deal. All right, the president threw all of that out the window. This now belongs to him. And if there is fallout from this that negatively impacts the United States, he owns it, and that is why I think a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill, even though they're very careful not to be too critical of the president openly, are really suspicious of the memorandum of understanding and, quite frankly, just don't like it.
Dave Weigel, I'm coming to you, but David Drucker, you said the president stuck to his word as it relates to Soleimani or Midnight Hammer. What word? When after Soleimani, he said the regime was going to be wiped out, they weren't. And after Operation Hammer, he said their nuclear capabilities were wiped out and they weren't.
Right. What I meant was his approach to using military force and his approach to doing so, particularly in the Middle East, where he wasn't going to get the United States involved in a real actual war, which is what the Iran war has been. Right. The Soleimani assassination was a quick burst. Operation Midnight Hammer was a quick burst. So I was not referring to anything other than that. But this war was specifically something he said he would never do. Nothing like it, not this war specifically or anything like it. And what he did was the first full-scale war that the United States has been involved in the Middle East since the Iraq War. And so that's what I was referring to.
Understood. Mr. Weigel, how high are the stakes for Republicans right now? You know, when it comes to these peace talks coming out with some sort of good outcome?
High in two different ways. One, the gas prices have come up. They'll come up again. There is a school of thought that gas prices going down after whatever conclusion is reached with Iran are going to solve the problems that Republicans started seeing in states 4 months ago. I've been around enough. I think some of that is true. Democrats have led every statement in the last couple months with how high gas prices are. They've taken on the costumes that Republicans had 4 years ago in blaming the Biden administration for every price increase. That might change a little bit, but I do think the second difficulty for Republicans here, it hasn't just divided the party, the intellectual wings of the party. You look at the conversations J.D. Vance has been having, the vice president's been having since before he went to Switzerland. He was very dismissive of Israel, its demands, Israeli politicians who are critical of the deal. I don't think the Republican Party will snap back to the positions on Israel it had at the start of the year. You've seen a much louder, bolder, anti-Israel voice in the party take hold, and you saw from Democrats a reaction to that. The Democrats now look at a political landscape where pro-Israeli groups are spending lots of money in their primaries. Even the Republican Party is not saying that the policy of the United States is to defend Israel and do what it wants in the Middle East. So that's a very complicated situation that's going to be playing out all year. Is Israel going to be the top issue in the elections? No, but the attitude both parties now have towards Israel is much different than it was before this war began.
All right, Dave Weigel, let me ask you about the Starmer resignation in the UK. We talk about divisions here, but it is around the world. This will be the UK's 7th prime minister in a decade. What does that tell you about how unhappy people are around the world with the establishment?
Starmer's government had very particular problems. He came in on a very strange landslide because of the splintering of British political parties. Their constituencies they wanted had been Tory for decades, but they only won them with 30% of the vote and what have you. So it was a very, very fragile majority, and I think you set it up. There's a collapse of faith that parties can run the government. There is a disaggregation between what the media covers and what governments are trying to do. Every incumbent government is finding that it can pursue a program, it can meet some metrics of success, as Starmer was doing, and the coverage is highly negative because there's a constant infighting inside the party, fighting its constituents outside the party. There's just, like us, the UK has pretty frequent by-elections, special elections we'll call them here. They changed the conversation about whether the government strategy was working. I even bring in the Epstein stuff. That was the problem for Starmer, too, that might be repeated in some other places. But no, every party's had trouble governing and convincing people that within the next year, the next 2 years of an election, that what it's trying is working. There is a very distrustful, from young people entering the electorate, a worry that the economy and the world that they're inheriting is much weaker. That's definitely the case in Britain, what the case here. And two, a sense that just this political class is not as good as the one that their parents had. It's not as decisive. It's not as impressive when it starts speaking. I would think of the optics of Starmer being the second British prime minister to announce, well, one case that they're holding election, the other case that they're leaving, with the same protester blasting music that overwhelms the prime minister's speech. There's a sense of chaos that's very uninspiring to people born after 1980 entering the electorate, and that's true in a lot of the world.
It sure is. Tyler, I wanted to ask you about the leader of NATO coming to the White House, but we have a question from a viewer that I know she is screaming at her television, and loads of other people are, so I have to ask it. This is coming from Donna from Miami. She wants to know why Jared Kushner is even part of these negotiations. She said, is he a government employee? Are we paying for all of his travel with our taxpayer dollars when he's not a government employee? What is his role aside from being a real estate investor? And why isn't Marco Rubio there? He's the actual Secretary of State. Donna, I hear you. Tyler.
Yeah, there's a lot about Jared Kushner's role that we don't have clarity on. And despite our insistent questions about it, we have not received a lot of information. We're told that Jared Kushner is not a government employee, that he's a volunteer assisting his father-in-law, the president, and his longtime friend, Steve Witkoff. In terms of his travel, sometimes they're on Steve Witkoff's private plane, sometimes they're on a government plane. It depends on the trip, and there's not a lot of transparency around it. Reporters do not travel with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner when they travel. But Jared Kushner says he's not a government employee. And why is Marco Rubio not there? That's a question for Donald Trump, who is deciding who he is sending. I mean, Jared Kushner was a government employee in the first term and worked a lot on Middle East issues. His portfolio included the Abraham Accords, which were a set of diplomatic normalization between Israel and several Arab countries. They've tried to expand that program in Trump's second term, and Jared has a lot of relationships in the Middle East. Critics would say those relationships are business relationships that intertwine government and private business, which people find to be problematic. Democrats have been blasting press release after press release about that exact arrangement. But Donald Trump, when I was in the Oval Office with him in January, we asked him about this very sort of practice of his sons and his family being involved in government and business. And he said, I prohibited it my first term and nobody cared or gave me credit. So why do I need to do it this time?
I saw Jared and Steve Witkoff at the White House on my last visit, hanging out, waiting for the president. And yes, he is not a government employee, but maybe doing one of the most important jobs right now in our government. David, thank you for joining us this morning. Tyler, I'm not letting you leave just yet. Coming up, Trump's Iran deal is, of course, dividing Capitol Hill as he is facing growing criticism from members of his own party. Dave were just walking us through it. Money, power, politics. Trump's memorandum of understanding is getting a lot of criticism from both sides. Dave Weigel just walked us through it. I want to share what former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, what she had to say over the weekend about all of this.
Just, John, because so many concessions were granted up front in this flimsy two-page memorandum of understanding that wouldn't normally and shouldn't have been granted until after there was not only a fully comprehensive deal to at least deal with their nuclear program, but also that those provisions that were negotiated had been agreed.
You might hear that and think, sure, she served under President Obama. Of course, she would say that. But take a look at what the editorial board of the New York Post, obviously owned by Rupert Murdoch, had to say. Quote the headline, "With the Strait of Hormuz held hostage, Trump's Iran deal is worse than the Obamas." I want to bring in Gautam Mukundu. He's executive fellow at the Yale School of Management and a new dad. And Michael Schnell, MS Now congressional reporter. Tyler Pager's still here. Gautam, you told the New York Times last week that Trump and Vance have no coherent view of U.S. interests or commitment to democratic values, and that this war is a perfect example of what happens when you go with gut instincts over expertise and knowledge. So what do you expect? Yeah. Where do you think this thing's going to go?
It's going to, my guess is that they're just going to perpetually kick the can down the road and keep extending this because Trump doesn't want to start the fighting again because that's politically disastrous for him. And the Iranians know that the longer this goes, the more leverage they have. So they're winning. The only thing that has been surprising about this war is how unsurprising it has been. Every beat, every note has been exactly what every expert who looked at this kind of war before the war predicted what would happen.
Michael, are you surprised by the amount of backlash from the right?
Yeah, I mean, yes. In this entire Trump administration, a continuation of Trump 1.0, we had seen Republicans on Capitol Hill be in lockstep with him, contort themselves into defending him for whatever scandal it was, whatever policy decision it was, announcement. And now we are seeing them go out on a limb and criticize him on something that's very important to him. And listen to these names: Roger Wicker, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz. These are his boys.
These are his boys.
These are not fake Republicans, as he likes to call some people. These are people who have defended him throughout every controversy, every scandal, and they are now saying that this is not working, that this deal is not good. They have grave concerns about this. Lindsey Graham over the weekend said, "I think this is going to fail." It's stunning in a sense because Republicans have been so closely aligned with the president. But on the other hand, it's not stunning because we are hearing from national security officials who are saying there are some real holes in this memorandum.
So what's the White House going to do with this, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the criticism, the White House is deploying the playbook that it always deploys when it gets criticized, which is attack, 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 and call people rhinos and say that Trump doesn't like them anymore. I mean, we're seeing Trump fight with the Italian Prime Minister Meloni over this very issue, him saying that she was not supportive enough of the U.S. So Trump is obviously very defensive of this deal. We're seeing them deploy surrogates to try to message around it. But based on sources I've talked to, Trump's biggest concern about this is any sort of comparison to Obama's deal. And obviously that is the point of comparison that everyone is going to use. He decided to rip up a nuclear deal negotiated by one of his predecessors, and now he has struck a new agreement. And so people are, as expected, comparing the two. And that is something that he is deeply fearful of, deeply upset about.
Okay, but
he thinks that he needs a better deal.
He's deeply fearful of it, Gotham, but if you have eyes and you know how to read, you compare the two deals, Trump's is a worse deal. And I'm not saying that anyone should trust by any stretch Iran in any way. But the first paragraph of this memorandum says there can be no threats by either side, and it is one of the very first things that Donald Trump does. Given that, how can we think this thing is going to go anywhere productive?
So the one productive place it might go is it might actually stop the fighting, which is something, but it'll stop the fighting because we lost, right? We started a war with no plan, with no strategy, with nothing other than they thought that if they blew up some things, something good would happen, which is, a child's view of war, not something that the people who lead a great nation should be doing. And then we lost because the Iranians had a strategic leverage that we did not. They were able to close the Strait of Hormuz. They were able to inflict huge amounts of pain on the global economy and on the United States. And the only thing Donald Trump cares about, his political standing. And we gave up because we just didn't care enough about fighting the war. Like, the only way to stop that would be to invade and conquer Iran. And the support for that in the United States could only be measured in negative numbers. We lost the war.
Michael, you've got new reporting this morning about the relationship between Donald Trump and Senate Majority Leader John Thune.
Yeah, it's been very clear in the public view that there have been tensions between the two. They've been on wildly different pages. There was the anti-weaponization fund, the president's rollout of that, completely delayed passage of the GOP's immigration enforcement bill, which was a big blow to John Thune. And then the president's decision to appoint Bill Pulte as acting director of national intelligence.
And he's now in that gig.
That thwarted a bipartisan deal to extend the U.S.'s warrantless spying powers, which was an embarrassment for Thune. And then last week, we saw sort of the pinnacle of this, which was President Trump directing Jay Clayton, his nominee to serve as Director of National Intelligence, not to show up for a confirmation hearing, which, by the way, was being fast-tracked by Thune, and it was going to be the fastest confirmation in history. So John Thune and Donald Trump have been on very different pages, and it called for a look at their relationship. I was told by one GOP senator that their relationship is awkward, and it's making the atmosphere awkward for everybody. Look, they are very different people. Donald Trump is a brash New York developer who came into Washington wanting to blow up norms. John Thune is a career politician who worked his way up GOP leadership to become leader and sees himself as a protector of the Senate as an institution. But certainly when you're talking about a Republican trifecta right now, and Republicans wanting to get things done, it's not helpful when you're reading from different songbooks. And then you start to talk about the midterms, where someone like John Thune is on the floor every day, wants to talk about affordability, wants to talk about issues important to voters, but Donald Trump's ill-timed announcements are thwarting that strategy overall. There is certainly frustration there, and we're seeing it spell out into the public view. And one more thing I'll leave you with. Donald Trump is going to be, we expect him to be on Capitol Hill on Wednesday, meeting with these very Senate Republicans, meeting with John Thune at their weekly conference lunch to talk about all this, but also being face to face with these critics, these foremost critics of this Iran MOU. It's going to be a fascinating lunch. It's happening behind closed doors. We'll be talking to our sources to find out what happens inside, but to be a fly on the wall at this moment of Republican disunity.
And let me just be clear. It doesn't matter if the Senate Majority Leader and the president are in the same party. They're supposed to have at least somewhat of a tense relationship, because we do, in fact, or should, in fact, have three separate but equal branches of government. Last I checked. Michael, thank you. Tyler, thank you so much. Gotham, you better stay put, because we need to discuss this when we come back. This and more, this confusion over whether the strait is actually open, what it can mean for oil prices. We're getting into it with energy expert Amos Hochstein. But first, right after the break, Gotham wrote all about it. Now that the world has its first trillionaire, we're going to look at how that mix of wealth and power could turn into a dangerous combination for us, you and me. Money, power, politics. More of it's coming up next. Over the weekend, there were conflicting statements about whether or not the Strait of Hormuz was open to traffic. But after the first round of negotiations appeared to have ended positively, and reports that several oil tankers sailed through the strait safely, oil prices are again falling. That is good news. Here with us to discuss this and more, Gautam Mukunda. He's also joining us, Gillian Tett, a columnist and member of the Financial Times editorial board. Gillian, first of all, I want to point out that Andrew Ross Sorkin's book, 1929, was one of the best books of last year. I just watched it serve you yet again while you were positioning for this segment, where you had to use his book to prop up the camera, which only makes me love work from home even more, even more. Okay, the markets opened a minute ago.
I'm so sorry about that.
I loved it. I loved it. Okay.
Where I am.
Okay, so the markets are up over 200 in the last minute. Oil prices continue to fall. Diesel prices could drop below $5 a gallon. How are you feeling about where things are going?
Well, we have this peculiar contradiction between wild exuberance in the markets and a pretty grim geopolitical situation and domestic political situation in many ways. So we have a really peculiar paradox stalking our world. This ought to be the best of times. You know, on top of all this, we're living through a golden age of silence, but we're also seeing these rising tensions. And one of the biggest problems is that so much wealth, as in 1929, is being concentrated in the hands of so few, and that will inevitably stoke up the risk of future backlashes.
That's exactly what I want to talk about next. Gautam, you recently wrote a piece for Bloomberg that we need to pay attention to. Billionaires, and now even a trillionaire, of course, Elon Musk, and how they can turn their wealth into power. Like, we've had super wealthy people before, but what is different this time?
So a few things. One is the scale of it. Elon Musk, to say $1 trillion, the human mind can't comprehend that kind of number. So let's think about it this way. Wealth can be translated into power in the American system. The Elon Musk, the day-to-day fluctuations in his wealth, just the random movements of the stock market, 1% of that random variation is more than the most expensive Senate race in American history. So Elon Musk can swamp a senator, a congressman, even a president of the United States in terms of his political spending about as casually as you or I would buy a soda. So that's that. The second is the number of people. When John D. Rockefeller had about this kind of wealth, he was the only person who had this kind of wealth. In the United States, there are actually quite a lot of people who can just casually alter the fate of politics with amounts of money that for them don't mean anything at all.
Okay, that's exactly the thing, because in the last presidential election, he reportedly spent almost $300 million. That's 0.2% of his $1 trillion. Given that, you've said he could capture a state. How concerned should we be as an American voter, and what can we do about it? Because, again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican running for office, knowing that there is this mega wealth that can wallop a campaign, what does one do?
So I think we should be extremely concerned, because this is a problem that republics have faced throughout history, right? The Roman Republic, sort of the thing on which every other republic is based on, fell in large part because this concentration of wealth in the hands of individuals, in particular a particular man named Crassus, allowed them to overthrow the government and use it for their own benefit, right? The purpose of a government is to govern for all of its citizens. But when you have this kind of wealth and power, it's very easy to say, what I want you to do is use it for me. And so there are lots of ways, because there is one example of a liberal republic that has faced this problem, taken it head on and beaten it. And it's us, we Americans. We've done it before. We know how to do it, because Theodore Roosevelt, when he was dealing with JP Morgan, said, look, in the United States of America, the people are sovereign, not a handful of wealthy oligarchs. And in this country, the people rule. And we know how to do this. We've done it before.
Gillian, weigh in on this one.
Well, absolutely. In fact, I've just been in Rome, and it's impossible to go around Rome as a tourist without looking at all this evidence of the fact that the Roman emperors thought they were going to live forever. They thought they had all the answers you could possibly want to creating the perfect empire, until it wasn't, and it imploded on itself. And the problem right now is that to make a democracy work, you have to have people who think they have skin in the game. They have to all feel that they actually both have a responsibility to keep the system working, and they stand to benefit from it if they actually do that. And the more that you have power concentrated in the hands of a few, the harder it is to actually have that sense of real democratic skin in the game for everybody. And having skin in the game doesn't just mean making sure it's not controlled by a few oligarchs. It also means everyone contributing something in the form of taxation, in the form of actually feeling they're part of an overarching system.
Gotham, we know that governments can check this kind of power. Do you see anyone trying to do that right now? I'm actually just thinking about the people of Albania out there protesting, but that's itty-bitty little Albania protesting a potentially crooked government in cahoots with Jared and Ivanka and a resort. That's much different to the kind of concentrated power and what's happening here and other places.
So you're starting to see a backlash, but it hasn't congealed yet, right? But when you're seeing every time a data center comes up, you see massive public revolt against that, right? That's partly because of the effects of data centers in the community. But I think it's much more about people being profoundly hostile to these forces that are concentrating wealth in these hands of people and saying, like, this is the one way we have to push back because data centers still need permitting. And so every data center becomes a referendum and these people keep losing. There is this sort of broader. So what inspired this whole idea was I keep having conversations with people who work in the family offices or the companies who work for these people, and these are really successful people, right? Military officers, executives, and they come to me and they are traumatized because nothing about their experience makes sense. They're used to like winning wars or profitable businesses, and that's not the goal. And I always have the same conversation with them. I say, look, when you're dealing with people who are operating at this stratosphere, you are not dealing with a normal business person. You are dealing with a king. You are a member of a court. You are a courtier now, not an executive or an officer. And your only job is pleasing the king. And you know what? A country can't have multiple kings. That's a problem. And that's what we're dealing with. We have people in this country who have levels of wealth and power that most governments, right? Most kings would look at with envy and awe. And that's very different.
I would just jump in and say, though, that what I find fascinating is that many of the really wealthy people right now in America can actually sense a bit of this point about their own republic, and a number of wealthy people I've spoken to who are basically creating escape hatches or some kind of backup plan if something goes horribly wrong is really striking. And to me, that's a sign that, yes, on the one hand, they feel super confident, on top of the world and quite literally running the world, but they also have this undercurrent of fear. And a world where a super rich person can't even go to the grocery, can't even walk to the end of the road without, massive security trailing them. I mean, security services right now bodyguards are absolutely booming in America because of this undercurrent of fear. And that's not a sign of a healthy society.
No, and we're out of time, but here's the thing. I'm having those same conversations, Jillian, and they're saying I'm getting a big security detail and a big estate in New Zealand. None of them are saying maybe I should just start paying more taxes or actually staying in the state that I actually work in. Instead, I'm using an app on my phone to count the nights I sleep in New York and then shuttling myself off to Florida or Texas to avoid taxes. Yes, they have this fear of the backlash, but they're not actually addressing it head on. They're just figuring out an escape route and how to elect more officials that'll keep democratic socialism at bay and not actually addressing the issue. Thank you both for joining us.